The diner was small, the kind of roadside place where the coffee smelled burnt long before you opened the door, where the neon sign buzzed against the pale afternoon sky like a dying insect. Inside, the booths were cracked vinyl, red faded to the color of dried brick. The air carried the greasy warmth of frying bacon that never quite left the walls. Midday quiet had settled over the room, just the scrape of forks, the shuffle of plates, and the low murmur of a country song leaking from a dusty speaker near the counter. At one table by the window, an old man shifted his weight slowly onto the seat. His back was curved, his movements careful, deliberate, as though every gesture had to be negotiated with bones that no longer obeyed easily. He wore a thin jacket, army green, the fabric rubbed pale at the elbows. A patch of a once bright insignia clung stubbornly to the shoulder. His hands trembled faintly as he lifted the menu. Not from fear, just from time. When the waitress appeared, a woman in her 40s, with tired eyeliner and a half-pinned bun, he cleared his throat. His voice came out quiet, but even, steady, like someone used to speaking when it mattered. "Just a cup of coffee, please." Black. The words seemed ordinary enough, but they carried a stillness that contrasted with the restless noise of the younger customers a few booths away. Two men in their 20s sat slouched in varsity jackets, laughing too loud at nothing in particular. One had a cap turned backward. The other bounced his knee as though the world couldn't move fast enough for him. When the old man's words drifted across the diner, they turned. Smirks crept onto their faces like a private joke neither had to explain. "Hey, Gramps," one of them called out, loud enough to carry. "You still remember how to use a spoon, or do they give you a straw for soup these days?" His buddy choked on laughter, slapping the table, drawing attention from nearby diners. A few people glanced over and then away, embarrassed for the scene. Others hid a smile, unwilling to get involved but entertained by the cruelty. That kind of laughter is infectious, but it's also cheap, and it stuck to the air like cigarette smoke. The veteran lowered his gaze. He didn't flinch, didn't bark back. He simply let the words pass over him like weather, like rain you've already stood in too many times. His lips pressed tight, the corners of his mouth twitching as though he might answer, but then he didn't. The silence he offered in return was heavier than any reply. One booth over, a family with two children shifted uncomfortably. The mother whispered something to the father, who shook his head, unwilling to risk confrontation. A pair of truckers at the counter smirked faintly, but kept their eyes on their coffee. The waitress pursed her lips, glanced toward the old man, then away, her tray trembling just slightly in her hand before she steadied it. The insult lingered. The laughter had been sharp, but the silence that followed was sharper still. It was the kind of silence that made people lower their eyes, afraid they'd be pulled into it, afraid it might demand something from them. And then, across the diner, unnoticed at first, a man set down his own cup. The sound of ceramic against wood was so soft it might have gone unheard, but somehow it cut through everything. He sat alone near the back, facing the room. Denim shirt, sleeves rolled once, his hair, still sandy but streaked with gray, brushed just above his collar. The lines on his face weren't those of fatigue, but of someone carved by time and discipline. He hadn't laughed at the insult. He hadn't looked away either. His eyes had stayed fixed on the scene, steady, unblinking, with the peculiar calm of someone measuring distance not in inches, but in intentions. Chuck Norris didn't shift in his seat, didn't posture, didn't clear his throat. He simply watched. And that watchfulness, subtle, unspoken, was the only thing in the diner more powerful than the laughter. The veteran, still looking down, wrapped his fingers around the handle of the coffee cup the waitress had set in front of him. The liquid trembled just slightly as his hand shook. He lifted it with care, the way you might lift a glass in a room full of strangers who've already decided you don't belong. He sipped once. Bitter, hot. He swallowed the taste, but more than that, He swallowed the insult. At the booth behind him, the two young men weren't finished. Their voices carried, careless, emboldened by the room's silence. One nudged the other and muttered something too low to catch, and both laughed again, eyes flicking toward the veteran like cats tormenting a bird with clipped wings. The old man didn't look back at them, but his jaw tightened. The line of his cheek trembled faintly. He was no stranger to hostility, but the cruelty of strangers in a diner, on an ordinary afternoon, had a sting sharper than he'd expected. The waitress returned with a pot of coffee for another table. She avoided his eyes, but the flush on her neck betrayed her shame. She wanted to intervene, maybe, but she didn't. No one did. And in that failure of courage, theirs, not his, the weight of the moment deepened. The young men grinned wider, satisfied with their stage, their audience. Yet, in the corner of the room, Chuck Norris's gaze didn't waver. He took in the scene like a chess player watching pawns make foolish moves across a board he already understood. His stillness was the opposite of the boy's restless energy. His quiet was a presence, not an absence. No one knew, not yet, that the balance in the diner had already shifted. The laughter still echoed. The old man still sipped his coffee. But something unseen had entered the room, as if the air itself had drawn a deep breath and held it. And soon it would exhale. Just wondering, where are you watching from? Write it down, bellow. The scrape of a chair against linoleum split the air. One of the young men, the one with the backward cap, pushed himself up with exaggerated stiffness, knees bent, arms crooked, dragging his sneakers across the floor in a clumsy pantomime. The imitation was cruel and obvious. A shuffling old gait, spine bent, lips pushed forward in a mocking grimace. He dragged his foot an extra inch, adding a squeak to each step that made his buddy slap the table in hysterics. It wasn't a joke anymore. It was theater. The laughter grew louder, spilling into the spaces between tables, bouncing off the glass windows. A couple of teenagers near the door pulled out their phones, the faint glow of their screens reflecting in their wide eyes. They weren't just bystanders now, they were audience. And the boy performing knew it. The veteran, still holding his coffee, raised his chin just enough to let his eyes meet the floor between them. His mouth worked, silent at first, as if he were wrestling with words he didn't want to say. Finally, his voice emerged, thin, unsteady, but carrying something underneath, something lived, something seen. "I've walked farther than you can dream," he said softly, "through places you wouldn't survive a day." The tremor in his tone betrayed him. His body could no longer back the weight of his words. They fell like leaves from a tree. True, but fragile, landing on deaf ears. The boy in the cap let out a loud theatrical groan, bending further, gripping his lower back as though it were breaking. "Oh no, don't shoot, Mr. Soldier. You'll miss your target." His buddy doubled over in laughter, coughing, slamming his palm against the table until the salt shaker rattled. Around the room, reactions split. At the counter, the truckers smirked but didn't look up. The mother with the children pulled her kids closer, whispering, "Don't stare," though her own eyes stayed fixed on the scene. An old man by the jukebox looked away, jaw set, his hand frozen over the selection buttons. He wasn't going to move, but he couldn't watch either. Phones tilted higher. Someone whispered, "Get this, man, it's gold." A couple in the far booth leaned in close, murmuring to each other with tight smiles, caught between discomfort and curiosity. The air thickened, that uneasy mixture of shame and fascination when cruelty becomes spectacle. The crowd, the third character in the room, wasn't just watching anymore. It was participating, feeding. Every chuckle, every glance at a glowing phone screen, every silence that allowed the boys to keep going was a small offering. The veteran's hand tightened around the cup. The coffee sloshed just slightly against porcelain. He didn't put it down, didn't rise. His shoulders remained rounded, his head slightly bowed. There was no outburst, no plea for dignity. Only the weight of his silence, heavier now, but not enough to stop the momentum rolling over him. Then a new sound, so quiet it barely belonged to the moment, slid into the mix. Ceramic touched wood, a cup returning to its saucer. The motion came from the back corner of the diner, so subtle that most people didn't even register it consciously. But those closest, those with the instinct to sense when the air has shifted, turned their heads. A waitress halfway to the counter stopped in mid-step. The teenagers with their phones hesitated, their screens still raised, but their bodies stiffening. Chuck Norris had set down his coffee. There was no rush in the gesture, no aggression, but something in the deliberate slowness, the control, had an effect no raised voice could. The sound was soft, yet it cut deeper than the loudest insult. It was a punctuation mark on the scene, invisible but undeniable. The boys didn't notice right away. They were too caught up in their performance, too drunk on the reaction they thought they commanded. But others saw. The couple in the far booth froze mid-whisper. The man at the jukebox glanced sideways. Even the mother with her children straightened subtly, pulling her kids' eyes away as if anticipating something she couldn't quite explain. The boy in the cap was still laughing, clutching at his back, but the laughter around him faltered, replaced with a creeping unease. The crowd didn't know why they were shifting in their seats, why their smiles thinned. They just felt it. A current, quiet but heavy, beginning to move beneath the surface of the room. The veteran lowered his coffee slowly, the cup landing with a faint clink on the saucer. He glanced once at the boy performing, then at the table where the second boy still laughed, though less freely now. There was no accusation in his gaze, only exhaustion, a kind of weary knowing that comes when you've lived long enough to recognize cruelty as nothing new. But the boys weren't watching him anymore. Their stage was too intoxicating, their belief in their own dominance too complete. The crowd, however, was beginning to sense the turn. Something was coming, though no one yet dared to name it. And in the stillness of the back booth, Chuck Norris leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table, his eyes locked on the unfolding cruelty. He hadn't spoken, he hadn't stood, but in that small movement, he became part of the story. The diner's noise shrank, not in volume, but in meaning. The laughter, the clatter of silverware, even the scrape of the boys' sneakers, all of it dulled around the quiet presence of a man who hadn't said a word. And though no one could explain why, hearts began to beat a little faster, because the air felt like it was waiting for what would happen next. The boy in the cap leaned closer to the veteran, emboldened by the laughter that still lingered in the diner. With a grin that showed too much confidence, he reached out and plucked the old man's hat from his head. The gesture was quick, thoughtless, like someone snatching candy from a child. The cap was worn, its brim curved from years of use, a faded emblem stitched above it. The veteran's thin white hair caught the fluorescent light as the hat disappeared into the boy's hand. "Look at this," the boy said, holding it up like a trophy. "Doesn't seem like you need this anymore, old-timer. Might as well let the next generation wear it." His friend whistled, clapping his hands together. The sound was sharp, ringing in the small room, amplifying the humiliation. The veteran's hand rose slowly, palm open, reaching for what was his. The movement carried no force. It was tentative, fragile, like a branch bending under too much weight. His eyes followed the hat, but the boy only stepped back, swinging it out of reach with a laugh. The diner erupted with noise. Some laughed outright, their amusement edged with discomfort. Others whispered, murmuring to companions as though the act demanded commentary. The teenagers near the door raised their phones higher, recording, waiting for another punchline. A few diners shook their heads, muttering, "Not right," under their breath, but no one moved. The old man's hand hung in the air a moment longer before falling back to the table. His coffee rippled, tiny waves breaking the dark surface. He didn't speak. The weight of his silence pressed harder, but it wasn't enough to pierce through the growing frenzy. Then, without warning, the noise fractured. It wasn't a shout, wasn't even a word. It was the sudden stillness that cut through, the kind that spreads without needing explanation. One of the teenagers lowered his phone first, eyes widening as he looked past the boy with the cap. Then a woman near the counter gasped quietly, her hand hovering over her mouth. Even the truckers, who had been smirking into their mugs, turned in their seats, their expressions shifting. The reason was simple. Someone was standing. Chuck Norris rose from his seat at the back of the diner. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate. His height wasn't overwhelming, but the controlled precision of his movement made the room feel smaller, as if the walls had shifted inward. The scrape of his boots against the linoleum was steady, unhurried. His face was calm, unreadable, his eyes fixed on the boy holding the cap. The boy hadn't yet noticed. He was too busy spinning the hat on his finger, showing it off to his friend, trying to coax another laugh from the audience. "What's the matter, Grandpa?" he jeered. "Your guardian angel finally gonna come save you?" The words hit the air like sparks in a dry field. The crowd stiffened, instinctively sensing the line had been crossed. For the first time since the taunts began, silence rolled heavy across the diner. It wasn't the fragile silence of bystanders avoiding involvement. It was dense, electric, bracing for impact. The veteran sat motionless, his eyes flicking once toward the figure approaching from behind the boys. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. He seemed to understand something the others hadn't yet grasped, that the moment had shifted beyond insult, beyond mockery. The boy with the cap twirled it once more, smirking. He turned half toward the crowd, milking their attention, blind to what was unfolding at his back. Chuck stepped closer. His presence wasn't loud, but it radiated through the room like heat from a flame. Every eye followed him now, every breath held. The second boy, the one sitting at the table, noticed first. His laughter stuttered, faltering as he caught sight of the man advancing. His grin slipped, replaced with something uncertain. He nudged his friend under the table, but the boy with the cap ignored him, too drunk on his own performance. The crowd's anticipation thickened, a pulse that ran through the diner. Conversations had stopped. Even the jukebox in the corner seemed quieter, as if the music had dimmed itself out of respect for what was about to happen. And then, for the first time since he stood, Chuck spoke. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. But the diner heard it, as if it had been whispered directly into each person's ear. The boy with the backward cap hadn't learned yet that silence could be more dangerous than noise. The room had gone still, but in his head it still belonged to him. He smirked, squared his shoulders, and shifted closer to the veteran. For a second he hesitated, then leaned in with the kind of arrogance that belongs to someone who has never once considered consequences. His body dropped slightly, and he drove his shoulder forward, aiming not for real harm, but for that humiliating nudge meant to jolt the old man sideways. Proof, for the watching eyes, that strength lay with the young. The veteran braced instinctively, but his frame couldn't hold. His spine gave the faintest curve, his arm wobbling around the cup. Coffee rippled violently against porcelain, the bitter scent rising sharp in the air. His lips parted with a startled breath, the small gasp of someone who knows all too well that one stumble could lead to weeks of pain, maybe worse. But the second shove never landed. A hand intercepted the boy's wrist, mid-motion. The touch was almost casual. Fingers closing in an exact grip, not a squeeze, not a yank. Just control. It was the difference between chaos and order, between a stone rolling down a hill and one stopped by a perfectly placed hand. The movement ended as abruptly as if the boy's arm had forgotten how to move. The sound was nothing more than skin against skin, but it rang louder than all the laughter that had filled the diner minutes before. And suddenly, the diner was silent again. Forks froze halfway to mouths. A waitress holding a pot of coffee tilted it just a little too far. A dark drop sliding down the spout before she remembered to straighten. The truckers at the counter stopped mid-sentence, eyes narrowing. Even the jukebox, playing a weak country ballad, seemed to falter in the corner as though embarrassed by its own noise. Only the veteran moved. His hand quivered slightly as he lowered the cup back onto its saucer, the porcelain clinking faintly. His eyes drifted toward the hand that had stopped the shove, then further, searching the face of the man who had risen. Chuck Norris didn't speak. His expression was neutral, calm, but the kind of calm that feels heavier than rage. The boy's grin slipped. He tugged once, trying to pull free, but the wrist wouldn't come. It wasn't that he was trapped painfully. There was no crushing grip, no bruising force. It was worse. His arm simply wasn't his anymore. The leverage had vanished. He was a puppet with the string cut. Confusion darted across his face, and with it a quick flare of fear he tried to bury beneath bravado. "Let go of me," he muttered too loudly. The kind of demand meant more for the crowd than for the man holding him. His voice cracked on the last word. The silence deepened, filled now with whispers that spread like sparks. "Is that— No way! Look closer! Jesus, it is him! I told you, it's Chuck Norris!" The words darted from table to table. A couple in the far booth leaned forward, eyes wide. The teenagers who had been filming glanced from their screens to the man himself, their mouths open. Recognition traveled unevenly through the room. Some knew instantly, others squinted, uncertain if reality could possibly match the image from memory. Fame looks smaller in real life. Wrinkles carve deeper, shoulders sit a little lower. But the authority, the way the air itself seemed to obey him, that was unmistakable. The second boy, still at the booth, pushed his chair back hard. The scrape of wood against linoleum sounded like a warning. He straightened, forcing a cocky smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His voice, though, carried loud, straining for the confidence he no longer had. "What are you gonna do, huh?" he shouted, his chin jutting forward. "This isn't a movie. You don't scare me?" The line was cheap, but he threw it anyway, a lifeline to pride. It rattled through the room, desperate, misplaced, and it landed with the weight of something final. The crowd felt it. They knew this was the last line before things tipped. The boy in Chuck's grasp jerked his wrist again, trying to twist free. But the grip shifted seamlessly, the pressure constant yet painless, redirecting energy back toward him. It was like trying to push against a wall that wasn't there. Your strength vanished into nothing. His forehead glistened with sudden sweat, a thin line darkening the edge of his cap. The veteran's eyes dropped to the cap, still in the boy's other hand. For a moment he looked not at the boy, but at the emblem embroidered there, his past reduced to a prop in a cruel skit. His lips pressed together, no longer trembling but firm, as if he understood something none of the boys did, that the moment had grown too large for them to control. All around, people leaned forward in their seats, some with phones raised, some with mouths slightly open. They weren't watching a joke anymore. They were watching a reckoning. Chuck finally moved, not forward, not aggressive, but just enough to angle the boy's arm away from the veteran. A single step, a single pivot. The motion looked small, but the effect was massive. The old man was shielded, the boy unbalanced, the entire crowd repositioned in their perception of who held power. The second boy puffed himself up, refusing to surrender his performance. "You think just because you're whoever you are, you can put your hands on people?" "Let him go!" He forced a laugh. It rang hollow. The laugh died without an echo. Phones glimmered like fireflies. The smell of coffee, bacon grease, and sweat thickened. The hiss of the kitchen's coffee machine cut off with a sharp sigh. And then there was nothing but the sound of breathing, short, sharp, and uneven, coming mostly from the two boys, who still hadn't realized the crowd had left them behind. Every other person in that diner had already chosen sides, and they weren't on the boys' side anymore. The second boy moved first, his bravado paper-thin but still alive. He snapped forward with a wide, clumsy punch. The kind of swing meant more for the crowd than the target. The backward cap boy tried to follow, jerking against the hand that had held him and throwing up a fist of his own, as if together they might turn the tide. Chuck's body shifted before anyone could blink. He didn't block with force. He guided. The first fist met only empty air, redirected by a small turn of his forearm, the boy stumbling a half-step forward as his own momentum betrayed him. The other's punch was caught in a gentle but absolute grip at the bicep, pushed aside like a curtain in a doorway. The sound of shoes skidding on linoleum filled the silence left by the crowd's held breath. The diner had never been so quiet. Forks hovered, coffee cooled untouched. Even the radio had gone dead. All that remained was the soft rasp of sneakers against the floor and the strained breathing of two boys trying to save their pride. "Come on!" the standing one barked, his voice cracking. He lunged again, desperate to keep the performance alive. His friend mirrored him, chin tucked, arms high in a sloppy imitation of fighters he'd watched on screens. They were wild, messy, all noise and muscle. Chuck stepped between them. His presence split their movement, and suddenly they weren't a pair, but two separate problems. A twist of the wrist folded one to his knees, eyes wide at the shock of his own body giving way. The other slammed into the edge of a booth, redirected neatly by a firm palm pressed against his chest. His breath burst out in a startled grunt as he crumpled onto the vinyl seat. No one clapped. The crowd wasn't watching a fight. They were watching precision. It was smaller than the movies, quieter, but heavier, like gravity itself had leaned on the boys. The veteran's cap slid across the table during the scuffle, brim brushing the condensation ring from a glass of water. He stared at it, lips tight, waiting, not for violence, but for its return. His hand hovered near it, trembling slightly, then lowered again. The boys weren't finished. Pride is stubborn. The one on the floor spat a curse, scrambling up, while his friend let out a strained yell and tried to grab Chuck from behind, arms thrown wide in a clumsy bear hug. Chuck moved sideways, hips shifting with mechanical calm. The hug caught nothing but air, and a small tap to the back of the knee folded the boy neatly to the floor. The other rushed up, only to meet a flat palm at his jaw, a redirection that spun him half around before gravity laid him out again. The room stayed frozen. The waitress pressed a hand to her apron without realizing it. One of the truckers muttered, "Christ," shaking his head slowly. The mother at the booth reached for her son's hand under the table, squeezing until her knuckles went white. Chuck hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't clenched a fist. His breathing was steady, measured, unchanged. He stepped back slightly, creating space as if inviting the boys to choose dignity now that their energy had drained away. He didn't look at them with anger, only a calm patience that felt more punishing than rage. On the table, the cap waited. Chuck picked it up with one hand, brushing a crumb from the brim before turning back to the veteran. He extended it slowly, deliberately, not looking at the boys, not looking at the crowd. The veteran reached up, his hand still unsteady, and closed his fingers around the fabric. The sound of cloth brushing skin was soft, but in that silence it landed like a verdict. He pressed the cap to his chest first, holding it there for a heartbeat, then slid it back onto his head. His spine lifted a fraction, shoulders rolling back as though a weight had been set down. For the first time, the backward cap boy lifted his eyes toward the man he had mocked. Their gazes met. The boy looked away quickly, cheeks flushed. The shame in that single glance was heavier than any grip Chuck had used. Phones lowered. Even the teenagers recording seemed unsure if they wanted to keep the footage anymore. Recording now felt wrong, almost profane. The boys sat where they'd fallen, chests heaving, pride cracked open for all to see. Around them, the diner breathed as one again. The hiss of the coffee machine restarting, the hum of neon in the window, the distant sound of a truck roaring down the highway outside. All the small noises of life returned, but changed. The lesson wasn't in the movements, it was in the silence afterward. Chuck stood calm, hands relaxed, watching the veteran adjust the brim of his cap. No performance, no speech. Just the fact that one man's dignity had been restored without a shout, without a punch, and that was louder than anything else that could have happened. The backward cap boy stayed on the floor, hands splayed against the linoleum. The heat in his face had shifted from arrogance to shame. He opened his mouth, closed it, then forced out words that sounded small in the heavy air. We didn't know," he muttered. "We didn't know it was you." His friend echoed quickly, nodding too fast. "Yeah, man. We weren't trying to—" The sentence died before he could finish. Chuck's gaze rested on them without anger. His presence filled the space in a way that made excuses shrink. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost quiet, but it cut through the diner more sharply than any shout could have. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about respect." The words landed with a weight that made the boys look away. Chuck didn't gesture, didn't explain further. He just let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit inside it. After a beat, he added, steady and flat, "You mocked someone who's done more than you'll ever understand. That's weakness, not strength." The veteran touched the brim of his cap, adjusting it with deliberate care. His spine lifted a fraction, his shoulders loosening as if a burden had been set down. He looked at Chuck, gratitude in his eyes, but Chuck only gave the smallest nod and turned back to his booth. He slid into his seat and lifted his cup, drinking the coffee that had gone lukewarm. The motion was ordinary, unremarkable, and that ordinariness made it more powerful than any speech could have. For a few heartbeats, the diner held its breath. Then, tentatively, someone clapped. Another joined. Soon, a ripple of applause moved through the room, uneven but undeniable. A few people stood. The waitress pressed her apron to her stomach, eyes wet. Even the truckers at the counter nodded, their smirks gone. Chuck didn't acknowledge the applause. He simply set his cup down, the ceramic tapping the saucer with the same quiet finality it had before the storm began. His eyes drifted to the window, where the afternoon light glowed pale against the glass. The boys didn't try to fight anymore. They gathered themselves slowly, faces flushed, movements clumsy. The backward cap kid shoved his hat into a pocket rather than wear it. On their way to the door, one of them managed a single word to the veteran, "Sir." It wasn't much, but it was all they had. The bell above the door jingled as they left, swallowed by daylight and the noise of the highway. Inside, conversation began to stir again, softer than before. The teenagers with their phones didn't post what they'd recorded. The family at the booth sat taller, their children wide-eyed but quiet. The veteran adjusted his cap once more, fingertips smoothing its worn brim, then settled back with the posture of someone who had finally been seen. Chuck placed cash under his check and stood. As he passed the veteran's table, their eyes met for a final time. No words, just a nod between men who understood what had been restored. He stepped outside. The door swung shut behind him, leaving the faint smell of coffee and bacon, the soft hum of neon, and a room forever changed by a moment of strength that had asked for no recognition. The applause was over. Life resumed, but no one in that diner would forget the silence that followed his words, or the way a man's dignity had been returned without a single raised voice,